Hello everyone! Welcome back to another video. It's been what many would describe as a hot minute, but I'm back with another one and I hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to be talking about the Parque de la Memoria, which is located north of Belgrano on the bank of the Rio de la Plata in Buenos Aires. The park, which includes 10 large-scale sculptures, was built in 2001 to commemorate the victims of the military dictatorship in Argentina, which lasted from 1976 to 1983. And today I want to speak briefly about this context, and I also want to give some insight into a couple of the sculptures and how they address themes of loss, censorship, and collective mourning. But before I get started, I just want to mention that the dictatorship is a very recent part of Argentina's history, and its legacy continues to impact Argentines today. So if the subject is too intense for anyone for whatever reason, please feel free to click away. Additionally, this is an incredibly complex topic that comes with a myriad of perspectives, and this video barely scratches the surface of everything there is to talk about. So I don't want this to seem like a definitive or an exhaustive account by any means. It's more of just a tiny insight into the subject matter, the park, and its art. So without further ado, let's get started. So for those of you who maybe aren't aware of the history of the dictatorship in Argentina, in 1976, President Isabel Perón was deposed after a very rocky presidency, and a three-man junta was established with General Jorge Rafael Videla at its helm. The junta imposed mass censorship and military control across Argentina and began to hunt supposed dissenters and their families, a period that is known as the Dirty War. They kidnapped or disappeared thousands of civilians and set up hundreds of detention centers where prisoners were tortured and murdered, and any babies born in the camps were given to military families. And over the course of the dictatorship, approximately 30,000 people were disappeared by the junta, and many people today still don't know who their biological parents are. Then, at the start of the 1980s, the government began to destabilize, and in 1981, Videla was succeeded by General Roberto Viola, who was quickly replaced by Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri after Viola struggled to maintain control over his military allies. After Argentina lost the Falklands War, Galtieri was removed from office in 1982. Then, in 1983, Raúl Alfonsín, a center-left politician, was made president in a democratic election, which marked the end of the dictatorship. Nearly 30 years after the dictatorship, under the leadership of several stakeholders, including the University of Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires city government, and multiple human rights organizations, the Parque de la Memoria opened its doors to the public. It was built on the grassy bank of the Rio de la Plata and includes concrete walkways, plenty of benches for civilians, and of course the collection of sculptures which are dotted throughout. More than 600 artists submitted works to the park's jury, and ultimately 9 were chosen, some of whom come from international backgrounds, which, according to the scholar Silvia Tadei-Segueres, reflects the belief that an international effort is necessary in ending affronts to human rights. Some people have been critical of the park's location away from the city center, saying that it marginalizes the issues the park is addressing. However, the location holds a lot of historical significance. It's situated near the Universidad de Buenos Aires, where many students were victims of the regime, as well as the Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada, or ESMA, which was one of the most notorious detention centers during the Dirty War. Furthermore, the Rio de la Plata was the site of death flights, where victims were drugged, loaded into airplanes, and dropped into the Rio. So the park's proximity to the river also has a lot of symbolic meaning in that regard as well, and it's something that the park's artists explore extensively throughout their work. So, given the scope of the kidnappings and deaths during the Dirty War, many of the park's artists reckon with the subject of collective loss. More than once, they address this collective mourning by evoking the personal and specific, crafting a through line between individual and shared losses. For example, Robert Eisenberg's Untitled, situated at the park's entrance, relates the personal loss of his family, who were disappeared between 1976 and 1977, to the destruction of thousands of families during the Dirty War. The work features 3 geometric forms based on a sketch of Eisenberg's family. Although the artist is drawing from his personal life, the non-figurative shapes add a universal dimension to his work. They could be anyone's family. Not only that, but their hollow interiors, their blankness, creates a sense of absence, like the anonymous shapes are a mere shell of the real human family members. The view of the Rio de la Plata through the empty centers quietly gestures at the forces responsible for this absence. Much like Eisenberg, Nicolas Guagnini also draws from his personal relationship to loss in his work 30,000, which sits atop the park's grassy slope, silhouetted by the Rio. Guagnini imprinted 25 white vertical prisms with a portrait of his father, who was disappeared in 1977. The image only comes into focus from one specific angle, requiring the viewer to circle the piece until they find it. Otherwise, the portrait remains fragmented and illusory. While Eisenberg and Guagnini draw from the personal in their work, Claudia Fontes invokes the historical. Her piece Reconstrucción del Retrato de Pablo Miguez is an iron sculpture of a young boy, Pablo Miguez, who was disappeared when he was 14. Like Eisenberg and Guagnini, Fontes makes the Rio an active part of her work. The statue rises out of the water. It's so far from the shore that it could easily be mistaken for a real person. The view of the little body, alone and adrift in the expansive river and its gray waves, creates a feeling of isolation that was incredibly chilling to behold. It calls to mind the thousands of people who met their death in the Rio, so far away from their families and communities, and in turn those who lived on and had to go without many of their loved ones. These artists' choice to highlight individuals' lives and individual loss is an especially powerful decision given the dictatorship's efforts to erase people's existence from society via the disappearances. In her book, A Lexicon of Terror, scholar Marguerite Feitlowitz writes about the term desaparecido, which was coined by the military and refers to those who were kidnapped and tortured under the regime. She writes that, quote, "A desaparecido was someone who was absent forever, whose destiny was to vanish. Officially, a desaparecido was neither living nor dead, neither here nor there. The explanation was at once totally vague and resoundingly final. Night and fog drawn like a curtain in the collective mind." Evoking the faces of individual people and stories through the resolute, immovable sculptures is a powerful antidote to this kind of erasure. The works will lost lives back into existence through their presence, and no work does this quite to the extent of the massive Monumento a las Víctimas del Terrorismo de Estado. The monument is constructed from 4 concrete slabs that cut through the park center. The slabs contain 30,000 plaques, 9,000 of which are engraved with the names of victims of the dictatorship in chronological order, and include their age and if they are pregnant at the time that they were captured. According to Tendesieres, the monument materializes a rift in history, a cavity retreating into negative space that reminds visitors both of a hidden underground dimension and the intimate burden of recollection it places on each of them. Ripping open the ground beneath their feet, it exposes Argentina's flawed foundation and reveals an open wound festering in the collective memory. Indeed, the monument creates a space for visitors to reckon with the widespread loss and the individual lives, families, and communities that were destroyed in the process. It serves as a kind of record that will not allow the loss of life to be forgotten. While Eisenberg, Guagnini, and Fontes focus on the erasure of human life in their work, other artists in the park address a different kind of erasure, the erasure of free speech. During the Dirty War, Argentina experienced a profound degree of censorship, during which people were afraid to write, produce, or even think anything that contradicted the military government for fear of being disappeared. As Feitlowitz writes, the country was largely silent during the Dirty War. Since torture and death were castigations for thoughts, people tried to stop thinking. Marie Orensanz engages with this history of fear and censorship in her work Penser es un hecho revolucionario, which translates to thinking is a revolutionary fact. In the piece, 2 vertical panels placed side by side spell out the work's title. Like Guagnini's work, the phrase only becomes legible from a particular angle, necessitating the viewer's participation and prompting critical reflection on the statement's meaning. Here, Renaissance underscores the importance of independent thought in building a just society, and she implicates the viewer in that process, pointing out their active role as members of communities and nations, and the responsibility that comes with that position. While the junta used fear tactics to repress dissenters, it inundated every level of Argentine society with political propaganda via journalism, public speeches, radio, even women's fashion magazines, to construct the image of an anti-Argentine communist enemy whose threat to the nation justified repressive military control, and to galvanize people around the junta. The omnipresent dissemination of propaganda made it incredibly difficult to discern what was true about the political and social landscape at the time. William Tucker addresses this opacity in his sculpture Victoria. He presents a massive concrete triangular shape that's severed at the top. Below, peeking out of the grass, lies the structure's mold. The broken shape alludes to the lives cut short by the dictatorship, while the mold's presence gestures at uncovering the atrocities that were committed by the junta behind a veil of nationalist self-aggrandizing propaganda. For Tucker, there is an element of hope to the piece. He is quoted stating that the strength and resistance of the shape suggests both the courage of the victims and restitution over time of decorum and justice. Similarly to how Tucker used his sculpture's mold to symbolically thrust the dictatorship's violent actions into the light of day, the street art group Grupo de Arte Callejero constructed a timeline of Argentina's history since the dictatorship, using a pathway of 54 road signs containing cryptic symbols and accompanying text. The text inclusion of qualitative data referencing varying viewpoints and sources pushes up against the junta's practice of forced silence and false reporting. The road signs' varied symbols could also be read as a reference to the way language was distorted and layered with subtext during the Dirty War. Feitlowitz writes about how widespread fear and paranoia inundated common phrases with new, horrifying meanings. For example, an innocent sign set up next to bus stops that read Zona de Detención and was intended to keep people from loitering was perceived as a threatening reference to the detention centers. Meanwhile, in the camps, torturers often gave themselves titles like uncle or priest in order to pervert references to daily life and incite terror. Given this history, the combination of abstract symbolism and fact-based text explores ideas of fact, fiction, and perceived meaning. So that's just a little bit of analysis about the art in the park and the history that the works are grappling with. And bringing it back to the question of how can art be used for social change, I think what's most powerful about the park and its sculptures is the way that the park exists simultaneously as a space for leisure and a memorial site. With all the benches, the grassy hill, the walkway along the Rio, the park is a place for people to socialize and simply enjoy the space and each other's company. Now, this might seem disrespectful, but I actually think it's quite powerful given that the dictatorship was so committed to breaking up families and communities and silencing free exchange between individuals. That history makes free communal spaces like the Parque de la Memoria evidence of incredible progress. And yet, just as much as the park is a social space, its sculptures and its placement along the Rio, where so many people lost their lives, won't let the violent history of the dictatorship be forgotten by visitors nor in the collective memory of the nation. It's through the sculpture's presence that the park can be a place of collective mourning and reflection as much as it is a site of communal joy and leisure. All right, well, I'm going to leave it there for today, but thank you so much for watching and for following along. I'm going to leave the link to the park down below in case you want to take a closer look. And I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!